Let me tell you about shit that's going on right now. It's crazy. I wanted to show more of the game and talk about the pillars of design, because the pillars of design is what every game sort of like hangs its mechanics on, which is delivering this sort of total experience to the player. And you know, our pillars of design are exploration, narrative, and combat. We are working on things. We got a good bit of time before everything is kind of put together and packaged and polished and stuff like that. So we're really going to show you guys what we're trying to do, and we are being pretty transparent about the development process, so you can see how we're going from the idea of what we want to do to the execution of what we want to do. So check it out, see what you think.
The game's basically divided up into two types of spaces, interiors and exteriors, which is pretty straightforward. All of our exteriors are handled on a streaming basis. So as you move from one section of the area to the next, we unload the areas you just came from and start loading in the areas ahead of you. And essentially, that allows us to string together very long areas because of our perspective. It's all linearly laid out for the most part. So it just kind of unloads behind you as you run and loads in the new stuff as you come in. And the way we've done that is the primary area is what we're calling a district. So Anasum is the name of the district. You saw it in the trailer, specifically trailer 5. And within that, we have neighborhoods. And each neighborhood is defined by essentially the number of chunks it is in the streaming level. So Blue Corner is the neighborhood you saw. Also in the trailer, that's about 2 chunks, and then it transitions to the next, which is also about 2 chunks, and so on and so on. Our biggest zone is Anasum, which is comprised of 4 pretty distinct neighborhoods. Each one of those is about 250 meters long. One I think is a bit longer. So I think in total the entire game spans approximately, I don't know, 7 or so kilometers. And that's not entirely linear, even though our perspective is linear. We do have areas like this where you can go into depth. And then that kind of comes up here and there. We're still experimenting with a lot of the approaches to this sort of thing, but it does add a lot of extra real estate that we can play with inside of a given area. So not only do you transition through the neighborhoods as you go laterally, all the interiors, all of the alleyways, things like that, add a lot more play space for you. And then we're also experimenting with things like rooftop spaces on top of buildings. So you'll go into an interior, work your way to the top, and then maybe have a rooftop with a vista or things like that. Not only that, the different areas of the city have very different characteristics. Whereas one is, very inspired by, say, New York City. One is more of like an Asian influence, or another might be in just a very different region of the city, featuring like waterfronts, things like that. So we're trying to give each area its own like pretty unique characteristics, and then hopefully the act of traveling through them, because it does change so much, gives you the sense that there is such a large area to explore. And the other thing is, once you're interacting with NPCs and doing missions and fighting and shopping and things like that, the spaces should feel pretty authentic in their presentation. It should feel like you're actually living in a slice of the city. So even though you're exploring it in a fairly linear fashion, it will give it the impression that there is actual depth and more going on there. In each area, we've decided to have a few signature things. Like each neighborhood will have its own unique restaurant, a club, and a couple other special interiors that represent kind of the character of that area. The signature areas are hand built, so we've got like the Blue Seville here, which is kind of like a jazz club. That's unique to the Blue Corner, and that also carries over to the types and names of things like the stores and the shops you can run into. And then the sort of less important shops and storefronts and things like that are handled via a tool that we've got. And between myself and one of our artists, we came up with kind of a set of types of stores that we wanted. And then that's basically represented by the type we list here. So it's like a bodega or a coffee shop or, you know, a food store, like a fast food place. And then because our streets work on a kit set, we know these need to be set dimensions. So we've got a 4, a 6, and an 8 meter variant of many of these. And then within each of those sizes, we've got different sorts of things. We can just, as new ones get added, they just automatically populate into the tool. And we can either come in and deliberately choose one. So this is actually the Italian restaurant, also from the trailer, but we can set it up so that, you know, if it doesn't necessarily matter what that storefront is, we can make it randomly chosen if we want to. We haven't really settled on how much of these stores and things will be generated at runtime, but it makes it pretty fast to add new ones and prototype and just see what we want for any given thing. So each district has like a kind of a threshold that he needs to hit for certain services. So we need to make sure that the player can always access, you know, a pharmacy or a gun store or whatever it might be. So that's all laid out ahead of time, and then we kind of figure out where things need to go. And then as we change and remold the buildings to fit what we want, we put in the new stores. So it's worked out pretty well so far. It's pretty straightforward. Then when it comes to areas we need to transition into, we have kind of a couple things. So in areas like the Blue Seville, we'll hand make that interior specifically for that exact club. So it's always the same every time. But then we have other areas which are more generative or procedural in nature. So one of the systems we have is for like kind of a generic apartment building. So like above this restaurant here, it's just sort of a standard style apartment. We have a couple of different systems. We can make the interior static, so it's always the same, but right here is an example of it choosing from a pool of interiors. So depending on what color the light above my head is, I'll know which of the test interiors I'm about to load into. But essentially, we develop a set of interiors that we know work for a given district. So an example of unassuming, there's a set of interiors that look good and make sense for that area. And then we'll choose a random one for you to load into. In this case, I think I got variant number 1. So that adds one layer of randomization, and that'll be unique to every player when they play through for the first time. So what happens is, the first time you enter a building, the system chooses an interior for you, and then saves that out. So any subsequent time you re-enter that same interior, it's the same building, and it remembers that. So there's not really much in this exact interior, but what it does do, in addition to randomizing the layout of the building itself, is we also randomize the rooms to an extent. So we come up with a set of rooms that look good or make sense in a given type of neighborhood, or, you know, whatever we're trying to do there. And then it will also, behind every door, choose an apartment, and then also gets saved out. So every subsequent time you re-enter that apartment, it loads that as well. So ideally, every time you play the game, and every time you go to a new place, it will show you a new thing for that playthrough. So you can come to an area and you aren't going to know, oh, well, door number 5 is this type of apartment, so I know exactly where, you know, the good item crate is or whatever it is that time through. And that also allows us to then assign NPCs to be living in these apartments. We have a system by which, we'll discuss it a bit later, but that's where it also generates things that have to do with that person or that mission. So, you know, things that are relevant to their personality or their story or whatever will also be populated throughout the apartments. So it's pretty good in terms of, for having as few people as we do to get a lot of content out there. Another aspect of this system, not only do we have it randomly choosing interiors for the building itself and the rooms, we have another system that lets us more or less infinitely generate a building. So what'll happen is you'll enter an elevator, and as the elevator goes up, it will stream in a level as it goes from a random pool. So sort of like a random pool of entire apartment buildings, this is a random pool of slices of floors. So as you transition up, it'll have, maybe a differing number of doors, or, a slightly different layout in the hallway of that area. And we've got this because there's the concept of just these massive towers of residences. So it allows us to, without hand building this just absolutely, giant 150 floor building, you can now enter an elevator and then just go up and then get off whenever you want. And then as it generates the floors and the rooms on those floors, those get saved out. So the next time you go and visit, those are the same rooms that are going to be there. And that allows us to have a lot of dynamic play space where we can insert special rooms or events or people in a space where we know that, we'll be able to fit them without worrying about, oh, we've already used up all of the space, in this entire area. And yeah, that's pretty much it, really, for that.